Right. I'm sorry you heard the joke about the nurses before, but anyway. Okay. If I can stop you there, I apologize. I hate stopping those conversations because I hope that they were good and useful ones. But I hope that that's the start of that conversation and that you can go back to it and pursue maybe further these issues that you were talking about. There will be an opportunity to, at the end, if you've got a burning question, hopefully, obviously not everyone will have an opportunity, too many of you, but I am aiming to try and leave 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So we'll take any questions that come up then. So, we've now covered 3 of our 5 areas, 2 more to go. The 4th is this study by Gibbs and Simpson, comparatively recent study, similar to the Chickering and Gamson American one, the 7 Principles one, in that it was a meta-study looking at all the literature and trying to distill it into some principles, or in this case they used the word conditions. But this study was different in that it was particularly focused solely on assessment. What could they, in the same way I'm trying in this brief presentation, what could they find in the literature and what from that could they distill into guidance around assessment? And they came up with these, what they called conditions, 11 conditions under which they could find clear evidence in the literature that assessment supports learning. Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that these 11 conditions are all equally important. Okay? I'm not suggesting that for 1 minute. But, nevertheless, I do think it's interesting. Here we have 4 of them. The words in brackets I've added as my attempt to summarize, if you like, what the key issue is. And it seems to me, as you'll see from my brackets, that 3 of these are essentially about motivation. And of course that links to one of our key characteristics for a deep approach. 3 of these are about motivation, getting the student to want to do the work, getting them to actually do it even if they don't want to do it, but getting them doing the work. And then the other on this page, number 3, is that the thing we give them to do should in itself be a useful learning activity. And it seems to me that's probably the most important of all, isn't it? Hopefully, whatever the task is we give the students to do, it's a useful learning activity. I don't know if this joke will work in translation, but I'll try anyway. I think it's very funny, well, fairly funny, not very funny. I think it's fairly funny that in English, one alternative meaning for the word academic in colloquial English is not very important. If in English we say it's an academic exercise, that's a subtle way of saying it's a waste of time. And I do find that kind of amusing. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't suggest for 1 minute that academic activity was a waste of time. But I do think that all too often our students don't quite see why we've given them the things to do that we have. You know, they think that we've just done it to annoy them or to keep us happy or to generate marks or something. And it does seem to be quite important that we do make clear and explain to the students why the things we ask them to do are going to be helpful and important. So they don't think that it's that kind of academic exercise. So anyway, going back to my main point, I'm not, I repeat, not suggesting these are all equally important, but I think it's interesting. We have 4 of 11 conditions here. The other 7 are all about feedback. The other 7 conditions are all about feedback. And as I've said, certainly the evidence in the UK is that out of all the things we do badly associated with assessment, this is probably the thing we do worst of all. I'll leave you to reflect on how good you think you are here in Iceland on your courses, but certainly in the UK, we know we're pretty bad at this. And I think it's ironic in a way that all of assessment's important, but I think this evidence here suggests that probably out of the whole assessment cycle, feedback is probably the most important part, yet the evidence seems to be, in the UK at least, that this is the thing we do worst. So if you're going to put any effort, time, energy into improving what you do in assessment terms, maybe, along with, I think, validity and the issue of constructive alignment, I would suggest probably the other most important thing you could possibly do is to consider your feedback mechanisms and processes. Remember the importance of promptness, the importance of students getting this feedback and acting on it. How do we make students act on the feedback we give them? And if we give them feedback on one piece of work and then we start a totally different piece of work, it's not very surprising they don't bother to take much notice or read it. How do we make linkages? How do we make them apply the feedback from this piece of work to the next piece of work? Do we even try? And the literature would suggest that we should, it seems to me. So, good. And finally, and now I have to try and be a little modest. This is a little difficult. This is some work that I've been associated with myself. Part of what's now our Centre for Excellence, our government-funded project, I and 2 colleagues in our university, we struggled with many of these ideas around assessment for quite a long time. And in one discussion or other, we had this sort of little breakthrough. It was a breakthrough for us anyway, when we said, actually, if we believe when it comes to learning in a sort of social constructivist view of learning and the learning process, and I'm sure that's a phrase that many of you know, it seems to me social constructivism is, as much as any idea ever is, almost universally now, I think, the sort of the main view across higher education around the world, or certainly in the English-speaking world. For those of you who've not come across it, I've tried here in just one line, which is a bit tricky, to summarize what it is. But if, as certainly all 3 of us who were having this conversation believe, if we believe in a social constructivist view of learning, when we're teaching physics or history or whatever, this was the breakthrough for us. Why should it be any different with assessment? Why should we be surprised when we give students the assessment criteria and say, here you are, here are the assessment criteria, this is how your essay will be marked? Why are we surprised when they don't seem to understand those criteria? Or they don't seem to apply them? Or it doesn't seem to help them improve their work in any way? Well, we wouldn't teach them anything else like that, hopefully. We wouldn't just say, here you are, here's a handout, read this, you'll know it then. Hopefully we'd do something else. We'd get them to engage with it. We'd get them to apply it. We'd do all sorts of, all that stuff we've been talking about for the last 50 minutes. Learner activity, engagement, interaction and so on. Why should we be surprised then if they don't understand what we're talking about when it comes to assessment? If we want our students to understand what the assessment process is, what the criteria are, what we're looking for, surely we should treat this as teaching them anything else. And that led us to this rather pompous phrase, a social constructivist assessment process, and a slightly longer definition than the first one there as to what that would mean. So basically, we should treat assessment like teaching our students anything else, and that means getting them engaged in that process at each of the key stages. For those of you who think better in diagrams, I think this maybe illustrates it better. So instead of just, I'm going to walk across, instead of just giving them the criteria and expecting them to understand, well then, let's give them some work to actually mark. And it might be work that we've written ourselves, it might be work from last year's students, it might be real work from the students in the same class, but let's get them actively marking something in order to understand the criteria. And similarly, when they've done the work, when we've written the feedback, let's get them to actively engage with the feedback in some way. Let's get them to discuss it in groups. Let's get them to rephrase our comments into their own words or into an action plan. When we give them a new piece of work, let's ask them, how have you taken account of the feedback from your last piece of work in doing this one? Let's make them engage with it in order that they learn from that process. And that's what we mean. Now, none of this is new. You could find examples of these things going on in all sorts of places in different universities around the world. What we think is possibly new is seeing this as a complete system and trying to systematically implement it. And of course, it's not this simple. There should be exactly the same going on for staff. We get consistent standards with our colleagues. How do we make sure we all know what we're looking for in the students' work and have common agreement about that? Well, you've got exactly the same issue there. Staff need to engage in the various elements of the process with each other if you're going to get some degree of commonality of understanding of standards. And of course, just to finish, it's not as easy as that, because of course there should be an interaction between the two. So we are not for 1 minute suggesting this is easy, but what we're suggesting is that as a university, or certainly as a department or a school or a faculty, we would argue if you truly want to address these issues, it would be sensible to try and create some kind of system, some ongoing, constantly interacting system like this, rather than leaving these different things to individuals to do ad hoc if they choose to, at a whim, some not doing it at all. And with 5 minutes to go, I will very quickly put my finger on the button rather than going through those. Oops, wrong way. Too far. There is a summary sheet, which I've now lost. Where's it gone? I'll go back to the slide. More haste, less speed. There we go. There is a list anyway, and you've got the handout summarising. There we go. All that I've said, and in fact a couple of things I haven't said because I took them out in order to save time. So if you're looking for some kind of assessment policy for your faculty, or if you're looking for a further discussion around with your colleagues to look at your practice, I'd suggest this might form a useful starting point as a checklist to see where have you got things right and where are the things you might want to work on. I'll stop there, and hopefully we've got 5 minutes for questions.
read in an American publication that you could ask students to tell you what questions they would like to answer in the examination, and I'm thinking of doing that about a month before the exam. Do you think it's a good idea, but what should I try to get out of it if I do that?
Yeah, interesting that you said you read that in an American magazine. I believe they also did that in Maoist China, actually, which is interesting. I think it's a nice idea. I guess you need to be careful. You know, if they get too subtle about this, do they just tell you the easy things? You know, because but I think engaging them with that discussion about what are the key issues for this course, what are the things we've been trying to get out of it, that seems to me very sensible. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for the lecture. I recognize myself in many of the problems here. I just have a minor question. It's about getting the students active themselves in the assessment process.
Yeah.
And I wasn't quite sure what you really meant on that issue. But something came to my mind. I have a big course and I have student presentations there. And sometimes there are 2 or 3 students at a time giving a mutual presentation. And it just came to my mind, and I've never done it before. But I thought if I should have the other students give their fellow students feedback in terms of like how will we good or not.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, and that's exactly the sort of thing I did mean when I said getting your students engaged. I think if you give them the criteria that you're going to use to assess them, if you get the students giving each other feedback in those presentations, everyone gains from that. There's more reason for your other students to listen and actively, you know, engage with those presentations. It gets them thinking about the criteria, and therefore if they come later, if they give their presentation later, this can be slightly unfair. The ones who come later will almost certainly do better presentations because they will have understood through that process better what to do. But yes, is my short answer. You also might get the people giving the presentation to self-assess too, using the same form. If you create a template, how well did they think they did, and why?
But if we go this far, should we also ask the students to assess our lectures, you know, the professor's lectures?
Yes. Don't you do that already? I mean, you have course evaluations, don't you, where students get to tell you what they thought about your courses, don't you?
But they say similar techniques every year. They're quite generous,
They're usually too generous, in my view. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. And I think you need to be very clever you need to be strategic in the questions you ask them too. It needs to move beyond a popularity contest into, you know, what were the good things. I think all too often those course evaluations tend to focus far too much on the teaching and far too little on the course. Absolutely. And in particular, you know, how many questions, if any, on your course evaluations are there about the assessment? Whereas what I've been saying is if the assessment is so important, I think we should be evaluating all of those aspects of the course. They tend, certainly from my experience in the UK, to focus far too much on the teaching.
One thing you could do is to ask them, what have they actually learned today? That tells a lot about your teaching. What do they take away from this lecture which is important to them? And the answer will tell you whether you have accomplished what you wanted to do. So
I think you can also build it in through the piece of advice on relating one group of knowledge to another. Because when you come to the second one later in the course and ask them to make a connection, you see what they brought from the first one.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So I have a good question. Well, I assume you're all a bit familiar with surface teaching, which you were mentioning, but maybe too familiar with it. But I'm wondering, can you give us some advice? Because my opinion is very often that when you move from what you refer to as surface teaching and surface evaluation to more deeper methods, students feel that you are moving from something being objective towards something being more subjective. So can you give us some implication on how we can ease that feeling it's sometimes seem to express when we move from description to analysis?
Yeah, okay. I think it links to a number of the things that I've said. It seems to me that you're right. I think both staff and students find it easier to assess some things or to see how some things are assessed than others. And yes, so we can probably fairly all agree, easily all agree that something is reasonably well presented, is reasonably fluent in the writing, is grammatically accurate or not. You know, it's got the right content in it that we wanted to see. I think you're right. When we get to how good's the analysis, how good's the evaluation, or the, you know, etc., that's when we're in danger of becoming more subjective. And I think you're right. And the students also have a far less clear about what it is we're on about. What do we really, you know, what do we mean by these things? And I'm not saying this is easy, but I think you need to do all the sorts of things that I was talking about. So we need clear learning outcomes, and we need clear assessment criteria, and we need to get the students using them, and that will help them. And when we get new staff in our departments, we need to be doing this as staff as well. We need to be talking about them. We need to have moderation meetings where we look at how you've marked it, how I've marked it, and do we mean the same thing by analysis? And I think by bringing it is that system at the end that I showed you. I think by doing all those things, we can help both the staff and the students get more objective. But of course, we're never going to be totally objective, and we all need to admit that. I think we've gone over 2 o'clock, so I think we better stop there. Okay. Well. Okay. I think I can take that out now.
Well, if I can just have your attention for a few minutes, I would like first of all to thank Chris Rust. He will be rushing off in a taxi, and as a token of our appreciation, we bought him a book to take with him on the airplane to read, or whenever he wants to read. And it's a book made by one of our very good artists in Iceland, and the name of the book is special. It's called Lost in Iceland, and you can kind of interpret it if you were lost or if we are lost. But we did say here on the card, our greatest thanks for your effort and help to make us a bit less lost in the assessment practice, in our assessment practices. So then you can, but I already told them about what to do if you get lost in the Icelandic forest. And
You do?
you do know that.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think the assessment forest is a bit more difficult. It's not enough just to stand up, but that's probably the beginning.
It's a start.
Right?
It's a start.
Yes. So,
Thank you. It was
thank
most
you.
unnecessary, but thank you very much.
very, 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 thank you.